The iron gates of the Morty estate groaned like a dying beast as the black SUV armored convoy swept through the rain-slicked driveway. Inside the lead vehicle, Dante Morty sat in a silence so heavy it felt pressurized. His knuckles were bruised. The skin split across his right hand where he had repeatedly struck the man who dared to challenge the Morty name earlier that evening. The scent of expensive cologne couldn't quite mask the metallic tang of blood and the sharp, acrid ozone of spent gunpowder that clung to his charcoal suit. At 32, Dante was not just the CEO of a global shipping empire. He was the Shadow King of New York, a man whose whispered name could halt a heart. But tonight, his mind wasn't on the territories he had reclaimed or the bodies he had left in the rain. His mind was a hollow chamber, echoing with a 15-year-old silence the silence of the night his younger sister, Sophia, had vanished into thin air. He stepped out of the car, dismissing his guards with a sharp flick of his wrist. He didn't want their presence, their watchful eyes, or their professional sympathy. He needed the cold, sterile solitude of his mansion. He walked through the grand foyer, his footsteps echoing against the Italian marble, but instead of heading toward his private study, a strange impulse pulled him toward the West Wing. The West Wing. The West Wing. It had been boarded up and forbidden since the day Sophia disappeared. No one was allowed to enter, not even the cleaning staff. It was a place where time had died, preserved in dust and grief. As he rounded the corner of the long, dimly lit hallway, his eyes narrowed. A faint sliver of light spilled from the doorway of Sophia's old bedroom. Dante's heart hammered against his ribs, a rhythmic thud of adrenaline and fury. "I gave orders," he hissed, his voice a low, predatory growl. He reached the door and shoved it open, the hinges screaming in protest. He expected to find a careless servant or perhaps a thief. Instead, he found a ghost. Small girl, no more than 5 years old, stood in the center of the room. She was dressed in a simple, oversized white nightgown that made her look like a porcelain doll lost in a wreckage of shadows. She didn't flinch at his violent entrance. She didn't scream. She simply turned her head, her large, dark eyes fixing on his with an unnerving intensity. Dante froze, his gaze dropped from her face to her chest, and the air left his lungs as if he'd been punched. Hanging from a thin, tarnished silver chain around the girl's neck was a key. It was antique, crafted from heavy silver, its bow shaped like a weeping willow. Dante knew that key. He'd seen it every day of his childhood. It was the key to Sophia's music box, a one-of-a-kind heirloom that had vanished with her 15 years ago. "Who are you?" Dante demanded, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. The child didn't speak. She merely reached up, her small fingers closing around the key, her gaze never wavering from his. Before he could move toward her, a frantic shadow appeared in the doorway. "Oh God, Lily, please come away from there." Helena Vance, the new live-in maid Dante had hired only a month ago, scrambled into the room. She was a quiet woman, always keeping her head down, her beauty hidden behind thick glasses and a drab uniform. She looked terrified, her face ashen as she realized who was standing in the room. She lunged for the girl, pulling her into a protective embrace, her body trembling as she shielded the child from Dante's piercing, predatory gaze. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the scent of expensive tobacco and rain-drenched leather, and the sheer, suffocating weight of his presence. Dante didn't move. His hand, calloused and strong, reached out and gripped Elena's upper arm, his fingers digging into the soft fabric of her uniform. The contact, the sun rose over the New York skyline, casting long, jagged shadows across the glass and steel monolith that was Morty Global. Inside the penthouse boardroom, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the silent anxiety of 20 high-level executives. Dante Morty sat at the head of the mahogany table, his tailored charcoal suit fitting him like a suit of armor. To the world, he was the visionary CEO who had tripled the company's valuation in 5 years. To the men in this room, he was a god who could crush their careers with a single nod. But today, Dante's mind was miles away from mergers and acquisitions. His thumb traced the rim of his espresso cup, his eyes fixed on a tablet screen hidden beneath the edge of the table. On it, a grainy security feed showed the west wing of his estate. He watched as Alina Vance moved through the hallway with a mop and bucket, her movements graceful, yet mechanical. Behind her, the little girl, Lily, followed like a silent shadow, the silver key around her neck catching the light of the morning sun. "Mr. Morty, the offshore accounts in Cyprus are ready for your signature," one of the directors ventured, his voice trembling slightly. Dante didn't look up. His obsession was a living thing now. A serpent coiled in his chest that tightened every time he saw that key. It was an exact replica. No, was Sal the key. He remembered the weight of it in his sister's hand the day she disappeared. He remembered the intricate carvings of vines and thorns on the bow. How could a maid's daughter possess a relic from a tragedy that had been buried 15 years ago? "Sign them yourself," Dante said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that silenced the room. "And clear my schedule for the afternoon. I'm going home." He stood abruptly, the heavy leather chair scraping against the floor with a sound like a dying gasp. He didn't wait for a response. He was a predator who had caught a scent, and the boardroom felt too much like a cage. When he arrived back at the mansion, the atmosphere was different. The grand foyer, usually echoing with the footsteps of dozens of staff, felt unnervingly still. He found Lily sitting on the bottom step of the grand staircase, coloring in a book with a focus that seemed too intense for a 5-year-old. Dante approached her, his heavy boots muffled by the thick Persian rug. He knelt down, a gesture that felt foreign to his rigid frame. From his pocket, he pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a doll made of fine porcelain, dressed in silk, a peace offering. Or perhaps a bribe. "Lily," he said, his voice softening into a register he rarely used. "Do you like this?" The girl looked up, her large, doe-like eyes scanning his face for a long moment before settling on the doll. She didn't reach for it. Instead, her hand instinctively went to the silver key around her neck, clutching it tightly. "My heart," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was the first time he had heard her speak in his presence. Dante felt a chill run down his spine. "The key, where did your mother find it, Lily? If you tell me, you can have anything you want. Books, toys, a garden of your own." Lily stared at him, her expression unreadable. And then she shook her head slowly. She leaned in, her small face inches from his, and pointed toward the library. "The lady in the wall says you shouldn't touch it," she murmured. "She says the blood is still wet." Before Dante could press her further, Alina appeared at the top of the stairs. Her face went deathly pale at the sight of Dante so close to her daughter. She hurried down, her hands trembling as she pulled Lily toward her, shielding the child with her own body. "Mr. Morty, please," she gasped, her voice thick with a terror she couldn't hide. "She's just a child. She doesn't know what she's saying. She knows more than you're telling me, Alina," Dante said, rising to his full height, his shadow swallowing them both. "He ran your background check. You were born in a small town in Ohio, worked in 3 different hotels. No criminal record, no husband, no family. It's perfect. It's so perfect that it's a lie. Nobody is this clean." Alina's eyes flitted toward the front door, the micro-expression of a trapped animal looking for an exit. "I just want a quiet life for my daughter," she whispered. Dante stepped closer, the scent of her fear mixing with the faint aroma of lavender soap. "Then tell me why your daughter is wearing my sister's key. Tell me why she talks about ladies in the walls." Alina didn't answer. She simply bowed her head and hurried Lily away, leaving Dante standing in the cold expanse of the foyer, his heart hammering a rhythm of suspicion and a strange, dark desire. Night fell over the estate like a heavy velvet shroud. Dante retreated to his surveillance room, a high-tech bunker filled with monitors displaying every inch of the property. He watched as the clock struck midnight. On screen 4, a door in the servants' quarters creaked open. Alina emerged, dressed in dark clothing, carrying a small backpack. She held Lily's hand tightly as they crept through the kitchen and out toward the service entrance. Dante watched with a grim smile. He had expected this. He had hoped for it. He wanted her to run so he would have a reason to hunt her down. He watched them navigate the labyrinthine gardens, heading for the old stone gate that led to the woods. They moved with a desperate speed, Alina constantly looking over her shoulder. She didn't know that every movement was being tracked by thermal sensors, that every breath was being recorded. The air in the garden was cool and damp, the moon obscured by a thick layer of clouds. Helena pushed through the overgrown rose bushes, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could see the gate just ahead, a silhouette of iron bars against the dark forest. "Just a little further, Lily," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We're almost out." She reached the gate and pulled at the handle, but it didn't budge. She tried again, putting her entire weight into it, but the heavy iron was locked tight. A sudden, blinding floodlight snapped on, illuminating the garden and turning the night into an artificial day. Elena screamed, pulling Lily into the shadow of a massive stone pillar. "Going somewhere, Elena." The voice came from the darkness, smooth and cold as a blade. Dante stepped into the circle of light, his hands in his pockets, his expression one of bored cruelty. He looked like a king surveying a peasant who had dared to steal from his table. Elena backed away, her spine hitting the cold, rough stone of the pillar. There was nowhere left to run. The guards she had tried to avoid were now stepping out from the shadows, their weapons holstered but their presence a clear threat. Dante walked toward her, his pace slow and deliberate. Each footfall sounded like a gavel striking a bench. He stopped inches from her, his presence so overwhelming that she felt the air leave her lungs. He reached out, not for her, but for the stone pillar, pinning her against it with his arms on either side of her head. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear as he spoke. "You aren't a maid, Elena. You're a ghost. You move like someone who has been trained to disappear. You look at me with eyes that have seen more than a simple servant ever should." He shifted his gaze to the child, who was staring up at him with a strange, eerie calm. Then he looked back at Elena, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that made her knees weak. "My sister vanished from this house 15 years ago. Since then, I have searched every corner of the earth for a trace of her. And now, a woman with a scrubbed identity shows up at my door with her key. Do you really think I'm going to let you walk away?" Elena looked up at him, her fear suddenly replaced by a flash of defiance. "You don't know what you're digging up, Dante," she hissed, using his first name for the first time. "Some secrets were meant to stay buried. If you open that door, you won't just find your sister. You'll find a monster that created you." Dante's grip on the stone tightened, his knuckles turning white. His face was a mask of cold fury, but beneath it, there was a flicker of something else, a realization that the woman in front of him wasn't just a witness. She was a piece of the puzzle he had been trying to solve his entire life. He reached out and grabbed her chin, forcing her to look him in the eye. "Tell me, Elena," he whispered, his voice a lethal caress. "Tell me who sent you. Was it my father? Or is he the monster you're so afraid of?" The heavy oak doors of the late Lorenzo Morti's study groaned as Dante pushed them open, the sound echoing through the cavernous, silent hallway like a death knell. He didn't let go of Elena's arm, his grip firm, but no longer bruising, a silent command that she was to remain by his side. Behind them, Lily walked with a ghostly grace, her small hand clutching the silver key that hung around her neck, as if it were a heartbeat she had to protect. The air inside the study was thick with the scent of stale tobacco, expensive leather, and the suffocating weight of secrets. This room had been the nerve center of the Morty Empire for 40 years, a place where life and death decisions were made with a flick of a pen. Dante hated this room. It felt like his father's ghost was still sitting behind the massive mahogany desk, judging his every move. He tossed a heavy ring of keys onto the desk and turned to Elena, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of recognition. "My father spent half his life in this room," Dante said, his voice low and raspy. "He claimed he was building a legacy for me, but he was building a labyrinth. And I think you, or rather your daughter, has the map." Elena remained silent, her gaze fixed on the floor, but Dante could see the rapid pulse in her neck. She was terrified, yet there was a stubbornness in her posture that intrigued him. He turned away from her and began to pace the length of the library, his fingers trailing over the spines of the thousands of books that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. He was looking for something, anything that matched the intricate, swirling pattern on the silver key. He remembered the nights he had spent as a boy, hiding behind the curtains, watching his father press a specific sequence of books or move a statue. But those were old tricks. This was different. He stopped in front of the west wall, where the shadows seemed deeper. He recalled the security feed Lily had led her mother to. "The lady is crying inside the wall," she had whispered. Dante's jaw tightened. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in the cruelty of his father. He began to pull books at random, his frustration mounting. Elena watched him, her eyes wide. "You won't find it by force," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dante spun around. "Then how, Elena? You seem to know so much about this house. Tell me where the lock is." Before Elena could answer, Lily stepped forward. The child, who had been a silent observer of the tension, walked toward the massive bookshelf that housed the classic literature collection. She reached up, her tiny fingers brushing against a weathered, leather-bound edition of Sao Dante's Inferno Sol. It was a cruel joke of his father's, naming him after a poet of hell. Lily didn't pull the book, she pushed it inward. There was a faint, mechanical click, and the entire section of the bookshelf receded an inch into the wall, then slid silently to the left. Behind it lay not a stone wall, but a door made of reinforced, brushed steel. It looked out of place in the Victorian elegance of the mansion, cold, modern, and impenetrable. At the center of the door was a small, circular indentation, and just above it, a high-tech glass panel. Dante felt the chill crawl up his spine. This wasn't a wine cellar or a safe for gold bars. This was a vault built for something far more precious, or far more dangerous. "The key," Dante commanded, extending his hand toward Lily. The girl looked at her mother, who nodded slowly, her face pale. Lily unhooked the silver chain from her neck and placed the key in Dante's palm. It felt unnaturally cold against his skin. Dante stepped toward the steel door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He inserted the antique key into the circular indentation. It fit perfectly. With a slow, deliberate turn, he felt the internal tumblers shift. A deep, resonant sow thud sow echoed from within the door, indicating the first lock had disengaged. But the door didn't open. Instead, the glass panel above the keyhole flickered to life, glowing with a harsh, crimson light. A digitized voice, cold and devoid of emotion, filled the small space. "Biometric authentication required. Scanning bloodline sequence." Dante pressed his thumb against the glass. The red light turned into a sweeping green laser that mapped the ridges of his skin. After a moment, the light turned red again. A buzzer sounded, a harsh, rejecting noise. "Access denied. Secondary authentication missing." Dante cursed, slamming his fist against the steel. "What more does it want? I'm his only son. My DNA is the key." He turned to Elena, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and desperation. "Is this why you're here? Did someone send you because you have the missing piece?" Elena shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know, Dante. I swear, I only knew about the key. I didn't know about this." She gestured to the high-tech door, her voice trembling. "My mother gave me the key on her deathbed. She told me it would lead to the truth, but she told me to stay away from the Mortis. I only came here because I had no choice. We were being hunted." Dante stepped closer to her, his shadow looming over her. "Hunted by whom? If you're lying to me, Elena, I will find out. There is nowhere on this earth you can hide from me." The tension in the room was suffocating, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. Dante felt like he was standing on the edge of a precipice, the answers to 15 years of nightmares just inches away, yet blocked by a wall of steel he couldn't break. He looked back at the door, the red light blinking like a mocking eye. He had the key, he had the bloodline, but he was still an outsider in his own home. He felt a small, cold hand touch his own. He looked down to see Lily standing beside him. She wasn't looking at the door, she was looking at his hand. Specifically, she was looking at the heavy gold signet ring on his right hand, the Morty crest, passed down through 5 generations of Dons. It was a ring his father had worn every day until the day he died, and Dante had claimed it as his birthright. Lily pointed a trembling finger at the ring, then at a small, almost invisible sensor located just below the glass panel on the door. It was a tiny, recessed circle, no larger than a coin. Dante frowned, looking at the ring. He had never noticed anything unusual about it, other than its weight and the intricate carving of the lion's head. He took the ring off, his pulse quickening. As he examined the underside of the gold band, he saw a tiny, microscopic indentation that matched the sensor on the door. It wasn't just a ring. It was a physical and digital bridge. His father hadn't just wanted a bloodline. He had wanted the Sao position Sao of the dawn to be the final requirement. Lily's eyes met Dante's, and for the first time, she didn't look like a frightened child. She looked like someone who had lived 1,000 years, someone who carried the weight of the world in her small chest. She leaned in, her lips brushing against the cold steel of the door, and then she looked at Dante. Her voice was a mere whisper, a sound so fragile it nearly broke in the air, but it carried the force of a thunderclap in the silent study. It was the first word she had spoken since she had arrived at the estate, a word that shattered the silence of her 5-year-old life. Matched, she whispered. Dante froze, the ring trembling in his fingers. He looked from the child to the door, a sense of profound, soul-deep dread washing over him. Lily knew, she knew exactly how to open the door to the horror that had been waiting for them all. Dante pressed the signet ring into the sensor, and the red light on the panel didn't just turn green, it turned a blinding, brilliant white. The sound of heavy bolts retracting filled the room, and the steel door began to hiss as the vacuum seal broke, slowly swinging inward to reveal a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical blow. Dante reached for his gun, his other hand gripping the edge of the door, ready to face whatever monster his father had left behind. He didn't see the look of pure, unadulterated terror on Alina's face as she realized that the door wasn't just opening to a room, it was opening to a past she had died to forget. The heavy, airless silence of the basement vault still clung to Dante's skin like a shroud as he stood in the center of his dressing room, the golden signet ring back on his finger. The door in the study had been opened, but the darkness within had been too thick, too pregnant with the scent of old chemicals and stagnant air, to explore immediately without proper tactical gear. More importantly, he had seen the way Alina's knees had buckled, the way her breath had hitched into a silent scream that never left her throat. She knew what was behind that door, or at least, she knew the man who had built it. But tonight, the secrets of the dead would have to wait. The living were far more dangerous, and they were expecting a show. Dante adjusted his cufflinks, the silver glinting under the chandelier, his mind racing. If Alina was the key to his father's past, she was also the bait for his current enemies. He had spent years trying to flush out the remnants of his father's old guard, the Great Council that whispered in the shadows of the Syndicate. Tonight's gala, a glittering mask of philanthropy and high-stakes networking, was the perfect trap. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he commanded, his voice a low, melodic rumble. The door creaked open, and for a moment, Dante forgot how to breathe. It wasn't the maid who walked in. It wasn't the woman in the shapeless gray uniform with her hair pulled into a severe, unflattering bun. The woman standing before him was a vision of reclaimed royalty. Under his strict orders, the city's finest stylist had spent 4 hours undoing the camouflage Alina Vance had built around herself. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant, intricate chignon, leaving a few soft tendrils to frame a face that was hauntingly beautiful. The midnight blue silk gown she wore clung to her curves, like a second skin, the fabric shimmering with every slight movement, mimicking the depths of a moonlit ocean. The low cut back revealed the creamy expanse of her skin, marred only by the faint, silver lines of scars he had caught a glimpse of, before scars that told a story of survival he wasn't yet permitted to read. Alina looked at him, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of defiance and sheer, unadulterated panic. She looked like a bird that had been forced into a golden cage, realizing that the bars were just as sharp as the claws of the predator watching her. "I can't do this, Dante," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They'll see me. They'll know." Dante stepped toward her, his polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. He stopped only when he was inches away, the scent of her perfumed sandalwood and something uniquely hers filling his senses. He reached out, his gloved hand tilting her chin upward so she had no choice but to meet his cold, piercing gaze. Cold, piercing gaze. "At this point, Alina," he murmured, his thumb brushing against the curve of her jaw. "I want them to see you. I want them to wonder why the dawn of the Morty family is parading a maid in front of the world. Fear is a powerful tool, but curiosity makes men careless. And tonight, I need them to be very, very careless." The drive to the Grand Metropolitan was conducted in a heavy, Suffocating silence. Lily had been left under the highest security detail in the reinforced nursery, but the child's parting words, that singular, haunting matched, still echoed in Dante's ears. He watched Alina out of the corner of his eye. She was clutching her small clutch bag so tightly her knuckles were white. She wasn't just afraid of the gala. She was afraid of the world she had been dragged back into. When the limousine pulled up to the red carpet, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi erupted like a barrage of gunfire. Dante stepped out first, his presence commanding the space instantly, and then he reached back, offering his hand to Alina. She hesitated for a heartbeat before placing her hand in his. Her skin was ice cold as they walked into the ballroom. The sea of elite guests parted like the Red Sea. Whispers followed them like a trailing wind. Who was she? Where did she come from? The ruthless CEO of Morty Global had never brought a woman to an official function, let alone one who carried herself with such a tragic, ethereal grace. The ballroom was a labyrinth of silk, diamonds, and hidden daggers. Dante played the part of the gracious host and a terrifying kingpin with practiced ease, his arm never leaving Alina's waist. He felt the way she stiffened every time a member of a rival family approached, her eyes scanning the room with the tactical precision of someone who had spent her life looking for exits. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of possessiveness. He didn't like the way the men in the room looked at her, not just with curiosity, but with hunger. She was supposed to be his bait, his tool, yet every time a man's gaze lingered too long on the curve of her neck, Dante felt a primal urge to wrap his hand around their throat. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear, a gesture that looked intimate to the observers but was laced with steel. Smile, Alina, you look like you're walking to the gallows. If you want to protect your daughter, you have to be the woman they fear, not the one they pity. I am the woman they killed a long time ago, she hissed back, her eyes flashing with a brief spark of the fire he knew was buried deep inside her. The tension reached a breaking point when the orchestra transitioned into a slow, haunting waltz. A tall, slender man with silvering hair and eyes the color of a winter sea approached them. This was Lorenzo, the head of the Valenti family, Dante's most formidable rival, and a man who had been a contemporary of Dante's father. Lorenzo bowed slightly, a predatory smile playing on his lips. Dante, he greeted, his voice smooth as aged bourbon. You've outdone yourself tonight. The Morty estate has always been known for its treasures, but this is a masterpiece I thought was lost to history. He turned his gaze to Alina, his eyes narrowing with a terrifying recognition. May I have the honor of a dance, signorina? It's been quite some time since I've seen Evance in such fine threads. Dante's grip on Alina's waist tightened instinctively. The air between the two men turned electric. A silent war of wills. He knew Lorenzo was baiting him, testing the boundaries of his protection. She isn't here for your amusement, Lorenzo, Dante said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, guttural register. But Alina, sensing the volatility of the moment, stepped forward. She knew that to refuse would be to show weakness, to admit she was hiding. One dance, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Dante watched them move to the center of the floor, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife hidden beneath his tuxedo jacket. He watched the way Lorenzo led her, the way he leaned in close, whispering things that made Alina's face turn ash gray. Dante moved through the crowd, staying close, his eyes never leaving them. He saw the way Lorenzo's hand pressed a bit too firmly into the small of Alina's back, the way he seemed to be savoring her discomfort. The music seemed to stretch, the notes turning into a dissonant blur. Dante pushed past a waiter, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He didn't care about the mission anymore. He didn't care about the Grey Council or the hidden room. He only cared about the look of sheer, paralyzing horror that was slowly consuming Alina's features. He reached them just as the song was beginning to fade, stepping between them with the force of a landslide. He snatched Alina's hand back, pulling her toward his chest. His eyes locked on to Lorenzo's with a promise of death. But Lorenzo didn't look intimidated. He looked triumphant. He leaned in one last time, his breath hot against Alina's ear, making sure his words were loud enough for only her and Dante to hear. The smile he wore was that of a man who had just found the final piece of a gruesome puzzle. Don't look so surprised, my dear, Lorenzo whispered, his voice dripping with a cruel, sickening familiarity. "The lion's den hasn't changed much since you were a child, has it? I see you finally found your way back home to the Morty Ben, princess. Or should I call you by your real name? The one your father screamed before he burned his world to the ground?" Elena's knees finally gave out, and if Dante hadn't been holding her, she would have collapsed onto the marble floor. Lorenzo gave a mock salute and vanished into the crowd, leaving Dante standing there, holding a woman who looked like she had just seen her own ghost. The drive back to the Morty estate was a suffocating vacuum of silence. Dante's grip on the steering wheel was so tight his knuckles were white as bone, the leather creaking under the strain of his fury. Beside him, Elena was a porcelain doll that had been shattered and glued back together, staring out the window at the blurred lights of New York. Lorenzo's words, "So, princess," the Morty lion's den cell hung in the air like a poisonous gas. Every time Dante glanced at her, he didn't see the quiet, unassuming maid who tucked Lily into bed. He saw a ghost. He saw the face of a family that should have been erased from the earth 2 decades ago. The moment the heavy iron gates of the estate clicked shut behind them, Dante didn't wait for the valet. He killed the engine, walked around to the passenger side, and hauled Elena out of the car. He didn't use his usual calculated grace. He was a predator who had finally cornered his prey. He dragged her through the grand foyer, past the startled night staff, and slammed the heavy oak doors of his private study. The room was bathed in the cold, blue glow of multiple monitors, the hum of high-end servers providing a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat to the room's tension. "Sit," Dante commanded, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. Elena didn't move. She stood in the center of the Persian rug, her gala dress torn at the hem, her eyes wide and glassy. "Dante, please," I said. "Sit," he roared, the sound echoing off the walls lined with centuries of Morty history. He stalked toward his desk, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "You thought you were clever, didn't you? A maid. A mouse hiding in the walls of the very house your father tried to burn down. I spent 15 years looking for the people who tore my family apart. And you walked right through the front door with a silver key and a child who looks like a miracle." The sharp sound erupted from the computer. The background check, the deep dive DNA analysis he had ordered the moment he saw Lily's key, was finally complete. Dante stared at the screen, his breath hitching. The red tetching. "Sao Matchfound, ELENVANCE, a logical offspring of Julian Vance. Status, deceased, presumed." So Dante turned the monitor toward her, the blue light casting ghoulish shadows over her pale face. "Julian Vance, my father's right hand, his most trusted advisor. The man who sold our security codes to the syndicate. The man who was there the night my sister, Sophia, was taken from her bed. He disappeared that same night, and everyone assumed he'd fled with his blood money." He stepped closer, his shadow looming over her. "And here you are, his daughter, living under my roof, using your own child as a shield. Was this the plan, Elena? To finish what he started? To wait until I was vulnerable so you could slit my throat in my sleep?" Elena's lips trembled, but no sound came out. She looked at the screen, at the name of the man she had tried to forget, and a single tear traced a path through the makeup on her cheek. "Answer me!" Dante grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her. "Did Lorenzo send you? Is that why he recognized you? Are you his little spy, waiting for the right moment to hand over the Morty keys?" "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't even know he was alive. I didn't know any of them were still alive." "Liar." Dante's hand moved to her throat, not to choke, but to force her to look at him, to see the raw, bleeding agony in his eyes. "The DNA doesn't lie. You are a Vance. You carry the blood of a traitor. Every second you spend in this house is an insult to my sister's memory. Tell me where Julian is. Tell me where he took Sophia. He didn't take her." Elena suddenly screamed, the force of her voice startling even Dante. She shoved his hands away, her chest heaving, her eyes burning with a sudden, fierce light that eclipsed her fear. "You think you're the only one who lost everything that night? You think the Mortis were the only victims of my father's ambition?" She began to laugh, a hollow, jagged sound that bordered on hysteria. "My father didn't run away with the money, Dante. He was a pawn. He was a coward who thought he could buy his way into the inner circle by offering up the only thing he had of value. He didn't just sell your sister. He sold me. Dante froze. What are you talking about? Julian Vance didn't love me, Elena said, her voice dropping to a haunting, dead monotone. I wasn't his daughter. I was his collateral. When the deal went south, when your father's men started closing in, the people he was dealing with, the people Lorenzo works for, they didn't just take Sofia. They took me as a bonus. They wanted to make sure Julian never talked. They kept us in the dark, Dante. In the damp, in the cold, for years. I wasn't his princess. I was his prisoner. Dante felt a cold chill wash over him. You're lying. You're trying to play on my sympathy. You were found in a thrift shop with that key. I wasn't found anywhere. I escaped. Elena's hands went to the zipper at the back of her designer gown. Her fingers were shaking so violently she couldn't get a grip. You want to know why I hide? Why I scrub floors and keep my head down? Why I never speak of the past? With a violent tug, she pulled the dress down, letting the expensive fabric pool around her waist. She turned her back to him, standing under the harsh light of the study's chandelier. Dante's breath caught in his throat. He felt the world tilt on its axis. Elena's back was a map of horror. It wasn't just scars. It was a systematic branding. Dozens of thin, white lines crisscrossed her skin, the marks of a lash. But in the center of her shoulder blades, there was something much worse. It was a jagged, burned-in symbol, a series of Roman numerals, and a geometric pattern that Dante recognized with terrifying clarity. It was the same mark he had seen in the grainy, black and white police photos from 20 years ago, the signature left on the walls of the room where Sofia had been kidnapped. They called it the Harvest, Elena whispered, her voice trembling as she clutched the dress to her chest, her back still exposed to his stunned gaze. I wasn't the only child there, Dante. There were others. They used us. They tested us. They were obsessed with the Morty bloodline, with the purity of the founding families. They did things to us that would make your Mafia wars look like a playground dispute. Dante reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from the scarred skin. He wanted to touch her, to apologize, to burn the world down for what he was seeing, but his hand stayed frozen in midair. The key, he managed to choke out. Lily's key, where did it come from? Elena turned back around, her face pale, her eyes haunted by 1,000 lifetimes of pain. Sofia gave it to me. The night I escaped, she pushed it into my hand. She told me it was the only way to get back inside. She told me that if I ever made it out, I had to find the heart of the Morty house. She stayed behind so I could run with Lily. Dante's heart stopped. Sofia's alive. She was there with you. She was, Elena said, her voice breaking. But she wasn't the girl you remember, Dante. They broke her. They turned her into something else. And Lily, she paused, a look of profound terror crossing her face. Lily isn't just my daughter. She's the reason they let me get as far as I did. She's the key to everything they've been building for 20 years. Before Dante could process the weight of her words, the mansion's high-tech security system began to wail. Red lights strobed through the study, and the monitors on Dante's desk suddenly flickered to life, showing the perimeter cameras. A fleet of black Est was crashing through the front gates, and men in tactical gear were pouring out, moving with the precision of a professional army. Dante lunged for the desk, pulling a heavy caliber handgun from a hidden compartment. Who is that? Lorenzo? No, Elena whispered, her eyes fixed on the screen as a man stepped out of the lead vehicle. He wasn't wearing a mask. He was old, his hair stark white, his face a mask of cold, scientific detachment. It's him, the man who made the scars. Dante looked at the screen, and for the first time in his life, the kingpin of New York felt a surge of genuine, bone-deep fear. The man on the screen looked directly into the camera lens and held up a small, electronic device. He pressed a button, and a voice boomed over the estate's intercom system, a voice Dante hadn't heard since he was 10 years old. It was the voice of his father, the man who was supposed to be buried in the family vault. Dante, the voice crackled, distorted by age and recording. Don't be difficult. Give us the girl. The experiment is nearing its final phase, and the vessel must be returned to the lab. Dante grabbed Elena's hand, his grip bruising. He didn't know what was real, but as the first explosion rocked the West Wing, the wing where Lily was sleeping, he knew one thing for certain. The horror wasn't just in the past. It had just kicked down his front door. The smoke from the explosion in the West Wing curled through the vents, tasting of acrid plastic and ancient dust. Dante didn't hesitate. He scooped Lily into his left arm, her small body trembling, but her lips pressed together in a silent, stoic line, while his right hand gripped his Beretta with white-knuckled intensity. Alina was a shadow at his side, her movements no longer those of a panicked servant, but of a woman who had spent a lifetime learning how to disappear in plain sight. They didn't head for the armored garage or the panic room. Dante knew his father's mind. The most obvious exits would be death traps. Instead, he led them deeper into the bowels of the Morty estate, toward the one place even the security cameras didn't reach, the private study of a dead man. The key, Alina, Dante hissed over the roar of another explosion echoing from above. Give me the key. Alina reached into her collar, snapping the thin silver chain from her neck. The antique key glinted in the flickering emergency red lights, its ornate teeth looking more like a jagged weapon than a tool. They reached the massive mahogany bookshelf that lined the northern wall of the study. Dante didn't look for a hidden latch or a loose book. He reached for the heavy, cast iron bookend shaped like a lion's head and twisted it 45 degrees to the left. The low, hydraulic hiss exhaled from the floorboards. The bookshelf didn't swing outward. It slid backward with a heavy, grinding sound, revealing a door of reinforced cold-rolled steel. There were no handles. Only two small indentations. One was a circular depression, the other a narrow keyhole. Lily, Dante said, his voice softening for a fraction of a second as he set the girl down. I need your heart. The girl looked at him, her wide, intelligent eyes searching his face for a long moment before she reached out and pressed the silver key into his palm. Dante inserted the key into the lock, but the door remained immobile. He knew what came next. He took the heavy gold signet ring from his finger, the ring that marked him as the head of the Morty family, and pressed it into the circular indentation. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a thin beam of blue light swept across the ring, scanning the microscopic imperfections in the gold and the DNA residue on its surface. A series of metallic clunks echoed behind the steel, the sound of massive bolts retracting. One by one, the door groaned open, revealing a downward-sloping ramp bathed in a sterile, clinical white light that felt violently out of place in the Gothic mansion. Alina gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. This isn't a basement. Dante stepped inside, his boots clicking on the polished linoleum. The air here was different, colder, filtered, and smelling strongly of ozone and high-grade antiseptic. As they descended, the space opened up into a sprawling medical suite that looked like it belonged in a top-tier research hospital. Banks of computer monitors sat dark and silent, and rows of glass cabinets were filled with surgical instruments that gleamed with a terrifying silver precision. But it was the center of the room that drew their eyes. Dozens of tall, cylindrical glass vats stood in rows, filled with a clear, viscous fluid. Most were empty, but at the base of each, a digital display flickered with a faint heartbeat rhythm. Project Resurrection, Alina whispered, reading the bold black letters printed on a steel door at the far end of the lab. Her voice was thin, brittle as glass. Dante, look at the walls. Dante turned, his breath catching in his throat. Framed along the walls were hundreds of blood samples, each labeled with a name and a date. He saw his own name. He saw Sophia's name. And he saw Sophia's name. And he saw his father's. He walked toward a large, leather-bound ledger resting on a stainless steel desk. Beside it was a stack of manila folders, thick with medical charts and high-resolution photographs. His hands shook as he reached for the top folder. He expected to see ledgers of drug shipments, lists of politicians bought and sold, or perhaps the coordinates to the family's offshore gold. Instead, he found a document titled Genetic Viability and Neural Imprinting. Dante began to flip through the pages, his mind racing to process the scientific jargon. It spoke of telomere lengthening, of cellular regeneration, and of a vessel capable of hosting a consciousness. He felt a cold sweat break out across his neck. His father hadn't just been a mafia don. He had been a man obsessed with the one thing money couldn't buy: Immortality. He had been using the family's vast wealth to fund a secret war against death itself, using his own flesh and blood as the raw material. Alina walked over to a rack of glass vials, her eyes fixed on one labeled with a series of alphanumeric codes. "These are all the same," she said, her voice trembling. "The DNA markers. They aren't diverse. They're all clones of a single source." Dante ignored her, his attention captured by a final, thick envelope tucked into the back of the ledger. It was sealed with red wax, bearing the Morty crest. He tore it open, and a single, glossy photograph slid out onto the metal table. He stared at it, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp, painful rush. The photograph showed a small girl sitting in a garden, playing with a silver key. She was wearing a white dress, her dark hair tied back with a ribbon. She looked exactly like Lily. Every detail, from the shape of her eyes to the small mole just above her left eyebrow, was identical. But it wasn't the resemblance that made Dante's heart stop. It was the date printed in the bottom right corner of the photo. The ink was faded, but the numbers were unmistakably clear. Sal, October 14, 2009. "Sal, that's impossible," Dante whispered, his voice cracking. "Lily is 5 years old. She was born in 2019. Alina leaned over his shoulder, her face turning a ghostly shade of white as she saw the date. She looked from the photo to Lily, who was standing by one of the glass vats, her hand pressed against the cold surface as if she were communicating with whatever had once been inside. "The photo is 15 years old, Alina," Dante said, his gaze fixed on the image of the child who shouldn't exist. "This isn't a picture of a child who looks like Lily." He turned the photo over. On the back, in his father's precise, elegant handwriting, were 4 words that shattered Dante's understanding of his reality. "Sal, subject 0, the original. 10 years before the first successful harvest." So Dante felt the world tilt on its axis. He looked back at the photo, then at the girl standing in the middle of the laboratory. The horror didn't lie in the blood on the floor or the guns at the door. It lay in the realization that the child he was trying to protect was a ghost of a past that had never truly died. He reached back into the folder, pulling out a secondary sheet of paper, a birth certificate. He scanned the lines, his eyes widening as he reached the section for the mother's name. It wasn't Alina's. It was a name he hadn't heard in 15 years, a name that belonged to a woman buried in the family plot. Dante looked up at Alina, his eyes dark with a sudden, predatory suspicion. "Are you really Alina? Because this file says the woman who gave birth to this child died a decade ago." Before she could answer, a soft, mechanical chime echoed through the lab. One of the computer monitors on the main desk flickered to life, displaying a live video feed. It wasn't a feed from the mansion's security. It was a countdown timer, glowing in a deep, blood-red way. Sal 00259. So below the timer, a message appeared in a scrolling crawl. So NITIALIZINGCONSCOUSMESSTRANSFERL detected within range. Prepare for integration. Sal, a low hum began to vibrate through the floor, and the glass vats began to glow with an eerie, internal light. Lily suddenly let out a sharp, piercing cry, clutching her head as she collapsed to her knees. The silver key, still hanging from the lock on the door, began to glow with a strange, pulsing heat. Dante lunged for Lily, but as he touched her, a jolt of static electricity threw him backward. He looked at his hands, seeing the skin redden as if burned. The room was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap that had been waiting for them to walk inside for 15 years. And as the countdown ticked toward 2 minutes, the heavy steel door they had just entered began to hiss, the bolts sliding back into place, locking them inside the tomb of the Morty legacy. The air in the subterranean laboratory grew thick with the scent of ozone and ancient dust, a cloying mixture that burned the back of Dante's throat. He ignored the stinging sensation in his palms where the static discharge had scorched him, his gaze fixed on the girl trembling on the floor. Lily's small frame was racked with tremors, her hands clawing at the stone tiles as if trying to dig her way out of a nightmare. The silver key at her neck wasn't just glowing. It was vibrating at a frequency so high it hummed like a trapped hornet. Dante's mind reeled, the logic of a billionaire CEO clashing violently with the instinct of a Mafia don. The birth certificate in his hand felt like a death warrant. The mother listed wasn't Alina. It was Sophia Morty, his sister, who had vanished into the shadows of New York 15 years ago. But the dates were impossible. The math didn't add up. Sophia would have been a child herself, and the record stated Lily was born a decade after Sophia was declared legally dead. "Alina, look at me," Dante roared over the rising hum of the machinery. He grabbed the maid by her shoulders, shaking her until her eyes locked onto his. "You told me she was yours. You told me you were protecting her. If you don't start talking right now, I will let this room swallow us both. Who is she? What did my father do?" Alina's face was a mask of shattered composure. The quiet, submissive woman who had polished his silver and scrubbed his floors vanished, replaced by a woman who looked like she had walked through the fires of hell and brought the embers back in her eyes. She shoved his hands off her voice trembling but sharp as a razor. "She is mine, Dante, not by blood, but by every tear I shed watching them stitch her together in a glass tank. Your father didn't want a daughter, he wanted a masterpiece. He didn't want Sophia back. He wanted a version of her that wouldn't fail him. A version that would never grow old, never disobey, and never die." Dante felt the floor drop out from beneath his feet. He turned to the wall of glass vats, the murky green liquid inside swirling as the internal lights intensified. "Project Resurrection," he whispered, the words tasting like ash. He wasn't mourning Sophia. He was replicating her. He called it the ultimate legacy. Alina said, her voice hollow, "I was one of the girls they snatched from the streets, the surrogates. They used us as biological incubators for his experiments. I watched 3 other women die when their bodies rejected the genetic grafts. I was the only one who survived long enough to carry her to term. When Lily was born, she didn't cry. She just stared at me with those eyes. Sophia's eyes. I knew then I couldn't let them have her. I waited until the night of the Great Fire at the upstate facility. And he ran. I thought if I brought her here, to the heart of the Empire, the last place anyone would look for a runaway lab rat was in the lion's den itself." Dante looked back at Lily. The girl's eyes were rolled back, showing only the whites, and her mouth was open in a silent, agonizing scream. The red countdown on the monitors hit cell 001, 42 cell. The word cell INTEGRATION cell flashed in rhythm with Lily's heartbeat. "What is the integration, Alina?" Dante demanded, lunging toward the computer console. He smashed his fist into the keyboard, but the screen remained locked, protected by an encryption he had never seen. "Why is she reacting like this?" "The key," Alina gasped, pointing to the silver heirloom Dante had found around the child's neck. "It's not just a symbol. It's a localized transmitter. It's keyed to her neurosignatures. Your father didn't just want to clone her body, Dante. He spent years mapping Sophia's brain before she was gone. He wanted to upload the consciousness of the original into the vessel. That's what the room is doing. It's a massive server, a digital ghost waiting for a host. It's trying to overwrite Lily's mind with Sophia's memories." The horror of it hit Dante like a physical blow. His father hadn't been a man driven by grief. He had been a monster driven by a god complex so profound he was willing to erase a living, breathing child to bring back a memory. Dante looked at his signet ring, the second half of the lock. He realized his father had planned this for decades. He had intended for Dante to be the one to find the room, to use the ring, and to inadvertently trigger the destruction of the girl he had come to care for. It was a final, sadistic joke from the grave. "Stop it," Dante screamed, grabbing a heavy steel chair and slamming it against the server racks. Sparks flew, and the smell of burning electronics filled the room, but the hum only grew louder. The glass vats began to hiss, steam escaping from the pressure valves. The liquid inside was draining, revealing the pale, translucent shapes of other attempts that had never made it out of the fluid. Lily's voice finally broke through the silence of the room. It wasn't the voice of a 5-year-old. It was deeper, melodic, and terrifyingly familiar. "Dante, it hurts." The dark in the water. Dante froze. That was Sophia's voice. The exact tone, the exact inflection of his sister's voice from the day she disappeared at the lake. He felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. The integration wasn't just a theory. It was happening. The ghost of his sister was being forced into the mind of the child. Lily, fight it. Dante knelt beside the girl, ignoring the painful stings of electricity that danced across his skin. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her small body against his chest. You are Lily. You are not a vessel. You are not a ghost. Alina was at the door, frantically clawing at the seamless steel. The bolts are electronic. If the countdown finishes, the room becomes a vacuum to prevent contamination. We have to break the link. Dante looked at the silver key pulsing against Lily's chest. It was the anchor. He reached for it, but as his fingers closed around the metal, the heat was so intense it began to melt the skin of his palm. He didn't let go. He roared in agony, his muscles locking as the current from the room's hidden coil surged through him. He was the bridge, now the kingpin of a crumbling empire, standing between the dead and the living. On the screen, the timer hit Sal 0 o'clock, 15 Sal. The room began to shake. The monolithic servers groaned under the strain of the data transfer. In the shadows of the laboratory, the hidden speakers crackled to life. It wasn't the white noise of a computer. It was a recording, a voice that had haunted Dante's nightmares since he was a boy. The voice of Don Lorenzo Morti, the man who had taught him that love was a weakness and blood was the only currency. My son, the voice boomed, resonant and cold, echoing off the reinforced walls. If you are hearing this, then you have proven yourself worthy of the Morti name. You have found the key. You have brought the vessel home. Do not weep for the child. She was never meant to be a person. She is a bridge to our family's immortality. Once the transfer is complete, Sophia will open her eyes, and our bloodline will never truly end. Accept the gift, Dante. Give your sister back her life. Never. Dante hissed through gritted teeth, his hand charred and smoking as he twisted the key with every ounce of strength he possessed. He felt the metal begin to snap, the delicate gears inside the antique casing grinding against one another. Saw 005. Saw 004. Saw 003. Saw with a final, guttural scream of defiance, Dante ripped the key from the chain. The metal snapped, and a blinding flash of blue light erupted from the center of the room. The shockwave threw Dante and Alina back against the walls, and the monitors shattered into 1,000 jagged shards. Kihim died instantly, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like a weight. Dante scrambled through the smoke, his lungs burning. He reached for Lily, who lay motionless on the floor. Her chest wasn't moving. No. He pulled her up, his hands shaking. Lily, wake up. Lily. Alina collapsed beside them, her face pale as a ghost. She pressed her ear to the girl's chest, her eyes wide with terror. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the sound of the cooling machinery and the settling dust. Then, a small, ragged gasp broke the silence. Lily's eyes fluttered open. They were no longer glowing. They were just the eyes of a terrified little girl. But as Dante let out a breath of relief, the heavy steel door didn't unlock. Instead, a secondary alarm began to blare, a high-pitched, rhythmic wail. On the one surviving monitor fragment, a new message appeared in jagged, broken text. CRITICALSYSTEMFEILURE. Biological containment breach. Purge protocol activated. TMINUS60SECONDSTONCINERTION. So Dante looked at the door, then at the vent in the ceiling. He realized the horror wasn't over. His father hadn't just built a laboratory. He had built a tomb with a fail-safe. If the experiment failed, he intended to burn every piece of evidence, including his own son. Tyrion, Alina screamed, pointing to the far corner of the room. From the rising smoke, a section of the wall began to slide open, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel. But it wasn't an exit. From the darkness, the sound of heavy tactical boots echoed. A group of men in black combat gear, their faces hidden behind gas masks, stepped into the lab. They weren't Dante's men. They wore the sigil of the old guard, the faction of the Mafia that had remained loyal to his father's shadow cabinet. The man in the lead stepped forward, raising a silenced submachine gun. He didn't look at Dante. He looked directly at Lily. "The dons will must be done," the man said, his voice muffled by the mask. "If the vessel is broken, it must be recycled." Before Dante could reach for his own weapon, a hidden speaker in the tunnel activated, and a new voice, vibrant, female, and dripping with a chilling, familiar madness, spoke over the comms. "Leave the girl, brother. She's just a failed copy. But you were always the favorite." Dante's blood turned to ice. He knew that voice. It was Sophia, but it wasn't the Sophia from his memories. It was a woman who sounded like she had been carved out of the very darkness they were standing in. "Sophia," Dante whispered, his grip tightening on Lily. "The original is back, Dante," the voice laughed, a sound that held no warmth. "And I'm coming to take what's mine." Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the west wing above them, and the ceiling began to crack. The masked man opened fire. The world dissolved into a cacophony of shattered glass and the rhythmic, bone-chilling thud of submachine guns. The laboratory, once a silent tomb of secrets, was now a kill zone. Dante didn't hesitate. The moment the first muzzle flash illuminated the smoke-filled air, his instincts, as the dawn of the Morty family took over, overriding the shock of hearing his sister's voice, he lunged forward, his massive frame a shield of muscle and expensive wool, slamming Alina and Lily toward the heavy steel desk that sat in the center of the room. "Stay down," he roared, his voice cutting through the screeching sirens of the Purge protocol. He pulled a custom Beretta from his shoulder holster, his movements a blur of practiced lethality. He didn't fire wildly. He was a surgeon of violence. 2 shots rang out, precise and punishing. The lead masked man crumpled, the crimson bloom erupting, where his goggles had been a second before. Alina didn't scream. To Dante's surprise, she didn't collapse into a heap of terrified tears. Instead, she curled her body around Lily, her eyes wide but sharp, scanning the room for exits. The timer on the monitor flickered 45 seconds. The air was beginning to shimmer. With a pre-ignition heat, the old guard mercenaries were pouring through the secret wall panel, their movements synchronized and robotic. They weren't here to negotiate. They were cleaners sent to erase a legacy that had become a liability. "The tunnel," Alina shouted, her voice strained against the roar of the ventilation system. "Dante, we have to go now, or we burn with the files." Dante fired 3 more times, forcing the mercenaries to dive for cover behind the high-tech medical pods. He grabbed Lily by the waist, tucking the small girl under his arm like a precious cargo, and seized Alina's hand. His grip was iron, a silent promise that he would not let her go. They scrambled toward the narrow passage the masked men had emerged from. As they crossed the threshold, a wall of flame erupted behind them. The incineration protocol had begun. The heat was a physical blow, singeing the back of Dante's coat as the laboratory was swallowed by a hungry, chemical fire. The screams of the remaining mercenaries were cut short by the roar of the blast. The tunnel was narrow, damp, and smelled of ancient dust and ozone. They ran, the sound of their heavy breathing echoing off the stone walls. Dante led the way, his mind racing. Sophia was alive. The realization was a jagged blade twisting in his gut. His sister, the sweet girl who used to hide in the gardens, was now the voice of a ghost, leading a coup against him. And Lily. He glanced down at the child in his arms. She was silent, her eyes fixed on the silver key still clutched in her tiny hand. She wasn't just a girl. She was a miracle of science and a curse of blood. She was the reason this war had started. "Where does this lead?" Alina gasped, her lungs burning from the smoke. "The West Wing cellar," Dante replied, his voice cold and focused. "But if they're inside the tunnels, they're inside the house. My security has been compromised. Someone let them in, Elena. Someone high up." They reached a heavy iron grate at the end of the tunnel. Dante kicked it open with a brutal force that tore the hinges from the rotted wood. They emerged into the wine cellar of the West Wing, but the silence they expected was replaced by the distant sound of shouting and the unmistakable crack of rifles from the floors above. The mansion was under siege. Dante set Lily down, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline of a man who had finally found an enemy he could fight. He turned to Alina, pinning her with a gaze that burned brighter than the fires below. "I need you to listen to me," he said, grabbing her shoulders. You are not a maid tonight. You are the mother of a Morty. Do you understand? If I fall, you take her and you run to the boathouse. Code 4492. The yacht is fueled. You don't look back. Alina looked at him, and for the first time, the facade of the quiet servant vanished. She reached out, her fingers brushing the blood on his cheek. You aren't falling, Dante. You're the kingpin. Now act like it. The raw strength in her voice sent a jolt through him. He realized then that he hadn't just brought a mate into his home. He had brought a lioness. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the bond forged in the fire of the basement. He checked his magazine, 4 rounds left. He needed more. He moved to a hidden cabinet disguised as a wine rack, punching in a code. The rack slid aside to reveal an arsenal that would make a small nation jealous. He grabbed a tactical vest, a submachine gun, and several extra clips, tossing a smaller handgun to Alina. She caught it with an ease that confirmed his suspicions. She had been running from a life that required her to know how to kill. Stay behind me, Dante commanded. They moved through the darkened corridors of the West Wing, a part of the house that had been closed for 15 years. The air here was heavy with the scent of Lily Sophia's favorite flower. It was a psychological weapon, a reminder that the ghost of the past was now the predator of the present. They reached the grand staircase, where the shadows of the old guard danced against the walls. Dante moved like a shadow himself, a predator in his own territory. He took out 2 guards in the hallway with silenced shots. His movements fluid and ruthless. He was no longer the CEO who sat in boardrooms. He was the Don who had earned his throne in blood. As they reached the upper landing, the very foundation of the mansion groaned. A massive explosion rocked the West Wing, the shockwave throwing them against the mahogany paneling. Dust and plaster rained down, blinding them for a crucial second. Delay. Alina screamed. Belinda screamed. Dante wiped the grit from his eyes, just in time to see a section of the wall, a secret passage he hadn't even known existed, swing open. A man in a matte black tactical suit, his face obscured by a skull-patterned mask, stepped through the debris. He didn't aim for Dante or Alina. With terrifying, calculated speed, he lunged for the child. Lily let out a sharp, piercing cry, the first sound of fear she had made. Dante raised his weapon, but the dust was too thick, the risk of hitting the girl too high. No, he roared, lunging forward. The masked man was faster. He snatched Lily up, his gloved hand muffling her cries. He looked directly at Dante, and through the eye slits of the mask, Dante saw a pair of cold, blue eyes that looked hauntingly like his own. The original ones, her prototype back. The man hissed. Before Dante could close the gap, the man stepped backward into the darkness of the secret tunnel. A heavy stone slab, disguised as a portrait of the first Morty Dawn, slammed shut with a mechanical finality. Dante threw himself against the stone, his fists bruising against the unyielding rock, his screams of rage echoing through the burning wing of the mansion. Lily was gone, taken into the bowels of the estate by a ghost, and the silver key, the only thing that had connected them, lay broken on the floor, its chain snapped. Dante, look! Alina cried out, pointing to the window. Outside, in the moonlight, a fleet of black SUVs was tearing across the lawn, but one vehicle was different, a vintage black sedan. The same model their father had driven the night he died. As the car sped away toward the orphanage on the edge of the estate, a pale hand emerged from the rear window, waving a whitely in the air. The hunt had begun, and the prey was no longer the maid, but the kingpin himself. The roar that tore from Dante's throat was not human. It was the sound of a predator whose heart had been ripped out through his ribs. He threw himself against the stone slab, his knuckles splitting against the cold, unyielding granite. The smell of ozone and burnt gunpowder hung heavy in the air, mixing with the metallic tang of blood. He felt a hand on his shoulder, a firm, grounding pressure that shouldn't have belonged to a trembling maid. He spun around, ready to strike out at anyone, only to find Alina standing there. She wasn't crying. Her face was a mask of crystalline ice, her eyes burning with a cold, focused light he had never seen before. Stop, she said, her voice like a whip. You're wasting strength. The stone is counterweighted. It won't open from this side without the mechanism. And the blast fried the circuits. Dante stared at her, his chest heaving. The woman who had spent weeks flinching and his shadow was gone. She reached down into the debris and picked up a discarded Beretta from one of the fallen guards. With a flick of her wrist, she checked the chamber, verified the magazine, and engaged the safety with the practiced ease of a professional assassin. Dante's eyes narrowed, his survival instinct screaming at the sudden shift in her aura. "Who the hell are you?" "Elena, the person who is going to help you get our daughter back," she snapped. Not looking at him, she began moving toward the main corridor, her steps silent and tactical. "We don't have time for your ego, Dante." If that was the vintage Cadillac Series 75, it's headed for the St. Jude's orphanage on the North Ridge. It's the only place with a reinforced underground hangar that matches my father's old blueprints. Dante grabbed his radio, barking orders to Marco and the rest of his elite security detail. "Assemble at the North Gate. 3 minutes. Full tactical gear. If anyone is left alive in that orphanage when I arrive, they better be the girl or the woman I'm looking for. Everyone else is a target." He turned back to Elena, catching her arm. "You stay here. I've seen your DNA. I've seen your scars. But I don't care if you can handle a gun. This is a war zone." Elena didn't pull away. She leaned in, her face inches from his. "I spent 4 years in a Spetsnaz-style training camp in the Urals because your father wanted his surrogates to be able to protect the assets they carried. I didn't hide in your house as a maid because I was weak, Dante. I hid because I was tired of killing. But for Lily, I will burn this entire city to the ground. You can either drive the car, or you can get out of my way." The tension between them was electric, a collision of two dark worlds that had finally merged. Dante saw the truth in her eyes, a shared trauma, a shared vengeance. He didn't argue. He led the way down the grand staircase, stepping over the bodies of his own men and the invaders alike. Outside, the night was chaotic. Sirens wailed in the distance, but the Morte estate was a fortress under siege. He jumped into the driver's seat of a bulletproof SUV, Elena sliding into the passenger side. As the engine roared to life, Dante pushed the vehicle to its absolute limit, the tires screaming as they tore through the manicured lawns. The voice on the radio, Dante said, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard the leather groaned. "The man who took her has," he said, "the original wants her prototype back." He was talking about Sofia. "My sister." Elena checked the sights on her weapon, her expression grim. "Sofia isn't the sister you remember, Dante. Your father didn't just kidnap her. He broke her. He wanted to see if the Morty bloodline could be perfected through trauma and biological manipulation. When her body started failing due to the early experiments, he started Project Resurrection. Lily isn't just a clone. She's the cure. They need her bone marrow, her stem cells. They need her life to keep Sofia's shell moving." Dante's blood turned to liquid nitrogen. The horror of his father's legacy was a bottomless pit. He had spent his life thinking he was the one who inherited the darkness by becoming Adon. But he was nothing compared to the monster who had sired him. He pushed the speedometer higher, the trees blurring into a dark, suffocating wall on either side of the road. "If she touches a hair on that girl's head," Dante whispered, "I will make the afterlife look like a sanctuary." They reached the gates of the abandoned orphanage within 15 minutes. St. Jude's was a Gothic nightmare of crumbling gray stone and ivy that looked like strangling veins. It sat atop a jagged cliff, overlooking the churning black waters of the Atlantic. The vintage sedan was parked out front, its doors open like the wings of a vulture. Dante killed the lights and rolled the SUV to a stop 100 yards out. His men were already positioning themselves in the shadows, red laser dots dancing across the cracked windows of the structure. He looked at Elena, into dim light of the dashboard. Her beauty was haunting a warrior queen born from the ashes of a maid. He reached out, his gloved hand cupping the back of her neck for a brief, heavy second. "We get her out, then we end this. All of it." Elena nodded, her hand resting over his. "Promise me one thing, Dante. If we find the lab, if we find the things they made, don't let any of it survive the night." "I promise," he said, his voice a vow of destruction. They stepped out into the cold, salt air. The silence of the orphanage was more terrifying than the explosion at the mansion. It was the silence of a tomb. As they approached the heavy oak doors, Dante noticed something pinned to the wood with a jagged silver needle. It was a white lily, identical to the one the hand had waved from the car window. But this one was dripping with fresh, dark blood. He pushed the door open, the hinges screaming in protest. The hallway was a corridor of shadows, the floorboards rotted and smelling of formaldehyde and old secrets. Far off in the depths of the building, a music box began to play a tinny, distorted lullaby that Dante recognized from his childhood. It was the song Sophia used to hum when they were children, before the world went black. Dante, Elena whispered, pointing her flashlight at the floor. There in the dust were small barefoot prints leading deeper into the darkness, and beside them, the heavy dragging tracks of someone who wasn't walking quite right. Dante raised his weapon, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct he had as a kingpin told him this was a trap, a lure into the lion's den. But as a man, as a father who had finally found something worth more than his empire, he didn't care. They followed the prince to a heavy iron door. The basement. As Dante reached for the handle, a voice crackled over the building's ancient intercom system, a woman's voice, melodic and utterly insane. "Brother, is that you? You're late for the family reunion. I've already started the first harvest." She's so quiet, Dante. Just like a doll. I think I'll keep her eyes. They're much prettier than mine. Dante kicked the door off its hinges, the sound echoing like a cannon blast through the hollow halls. He didn't wait for his men. He plunged into the stairwell, Elena right at his heels, descending into a world of fluorescent lights and stainless steel that lay hidden beneath the rotting wood of the orphanage. They rounded the corner into a wide, sterile laboratory, and Dante froze. In the center of the room, strapped to a glass surgical table, was Lily. She was surrounded by monitors pulsing with her heartbeat. Standing over her, holding a gleaming scalpel, was a woman whose face was a twisted, scarred reflection of Dante's own. Sophia Morty smiled, her eyes wide and glassy, as she pressed the blade against Lily's small, pale throat. "One more step, big brother," Sophia cooed, "and we see if the prototype bleeds the same color as the original." The air in the sterile laboratory felt like a tune, thick with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of old blood. Dante's hand, usually as steady as a mountain, trembled slightly as he kept his weapon leveled at the woman who shared his blood. Sophia. The name had been a prayer for 15 years, a hollow ache in his chest that he had tried to fill with power and violence. But the creature standing before him wasn't the sweet girl who used to braid flowers in the Morty gardens. Her skin was a translucent, sickly parchment, stretched tight over a face that had been reconstructed by clumsy, clinical hands. Deep, jagged scars ran from her jawline to her collarbone, and her eyes, once a bright, soulful blue, were now milky and clouded with a feverish, predatory light. "Sophia, put the blade down," Dante commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl that masked the shattering of his soul. "This isn't you. You're home now. I found you." Sophia let out a high, melodic laugh that ended in a wet, rattling cough. She didn't move the scalpel an inch from Lily's throat. The little girl remained eerily still, her eyes wide and fixed on the ceiling, her breath coming in shallow, sonic gasps. "Home. There is no home for a ghost, Dante. Our father made sure of that. He didn't just let me disappear. He harvested me. He broke me down into sequences and codes, trying to find the secret to outrun death." She leaned down, sniffing Lily's hair with a disturbing, animalistic intensity. "And then he made her, my replacement, a fresh canvas, a vessel that wouldn't rot from the inside out like I am." Elena moved with the silent grace of a panther, shifting her weight to the balls of her feet. Her eyes were locked on the monitor, watching the erratic spikes in Lily's heart rate. "She is a child, Sophia," Elena said, her voice surprisingly steady, though her knuckles were white where she gripped her own concealed blade. "She isn't a project. She's your blood. She's the only thing left of the Morty legacy that isn't stained with filth." Sophia's eyes snapped to Elena, a flicker of recognition and intense hatred burning through the cataracts. The surrogate, the little mouse who thought she could steal a masterpiece and hide it in the walls of a mansion. "I know you, Elena. I watched you through the cameras for years. I watched you love a shadow. You thought you were protecting her? You were just ripening her for me." Sophia's hand tightened on the scalpel, and a tiny bead of crimson appeared on Lily's pale skin. Dante flinched as if he had been the one cut. Don't. Whatever you want, Sophia. I will give it to you. My empire, my life, the Morty assets, everything. Just let the girl go. I don't want your money, Dante. I don't want your throne. Sophia screamed, her voice cracking into a jagged sob. I want my life back. Look at me. My cells are dying. My bone marrow is a desert. Every day is an agony you cannot conceive. Father's Project Resurrection wasn't about bringing back the dead. It was about sustaining the living through the sacrifice of the innocent. Lily is the only match. Her marrow, her blood, her very essence is the key to my survival. She is the cure he promised me before he died in that basement. She turned back to the surgical table, her movements jerky and frantic. She began to flick switches on a nearby console, and the hum of the machinery rose to a deafening whine. The process is simple, really. Total extraction. She won't feel much after the first few minutes. The brain shuts down when the blood volume drops that low. It's quite merciful, compared to what Father did to me. I won't let you touch her, Elena hissed, her body coiling like a spring. You have no choice, Sophia shrieked, her face contorting into a mask of pure madness. Dante, look at the monitors. This facility is rigged. The moment her heart stops or the moment you step past that yellow line, the oxygen scrubbers will release sarin gas. We all die together. A big, happy family reunion in hell. Dante looked at the floor and saw the faint yellow line painted on the concrete. Barely 5 feet away, he was the kingpin of New York, a man who had ordered the deaths of hundreds without blinking. But here, in the bowels of this nightmare, he was powerless. He looked at Lily, the child who carried the key to his sister's room, the child who was a miracle of science and a tragedy of fate. Then he looked at Sophia, the broken remains of his childhood, the sister he had failed to protect. Sophia, look at me, Dante said, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. The man who did this to you is dead. I killed him. I burned his legacy to the ground. You don't have to be his monster anymore. We can find another way. I have the best doctors in the world. We can find a donor. There is no other way. Sophia interrupted, her eyes darting around the room, as if she were seeing things they couldn't. She was the only one. She is the copy. She was made for this. Why do you care about a doll made in a lab? I am your sister. I am the one who shared your mother's womb. I am the one who suffered while you sat on your golden throne playing king. The music box from the hallway began to play again. The sound piped through the lab's speakers. It was a distorted, slowed-down version of the lullaby, sounding like a death knell. Sophia began to hum along, her body swaying rhythmically as she lowered the scalpel toward Lily's chest, aiming for the sternum to begin the extraction. Dante, now, Elena screamed. Elena didn't wait for his command. She reached into her jacket and threw a flashbang canister she had liberated from Dante's armory. The world exploded in a blinding white light and a roar of sound. In that split second of chaos, Elena lunged forward, her objective clear. But Sophia, fueled by a decade of madness and survival instinct, didn't recoil. She swung the scalpel blindly, the blade whistling through the air. Dante moved faster than he ever had in his life. He didn't go for his gun. He went for the girl. He crossed the yellow line, ignoring the hiss of the gas vents beginning to open. He tackled Sophia just as her blade descended, the two of them crashing into a rack of glass vials. The sound of shattering glass filled the room like 1,000 breaking mirrors. They rolled across the floor, a blur of black silk and white lab coats. Sophia was surprisingly strong, her fingers clawing at Dante's eyes with a feral desperation. Let me live, she howled, her voice a guttural rasp. Let me have her. Elena was at the table, her hands flying over the restraints that held Lily. Lily, baby, look at me. It's Mommy. I've got you, she whispered, her fingers fumbling with the heavy steel buckles. Lily's eyes finally moved, focusing on Elena, a single tear rolling down her cheek. She didn't speak, but her small hand reached out, clutching the broken silver key that still hung around her neck. Dante pinned Sophia's wrists to the floor, his weight crushing her frail frame. He looked down at her, And for a moment, the madness cleared from her eyes. She looked at him with a piercing, lucid sorrow that nearly broke him. You always loved the idea of me more than the reality, Dante, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hiss of the gas. You want to be the hero, but in this story, the hero has to commit a murder to save a ghost. She suddenly went limp beneath him. Dante's grip loosened for a fraction of a second, a mistake born of a brother's lingering love. In that heartbeat, Sophia reached for a hidden lever on the side of the surgical table, a manual override. The system is failing, Dante. Sophia smiled, a grotesque, bloody grin. The gas is just the beginning. The self-destruct was key to my heartbeat. If I don't get what I need, nobody leaves this orphanage. She held a small, black remote in her hand, her thumb hovering over a crimson button. She looked from Dante to the table where Alina was frantically trying to shield Lily. The laboratory lights began to flicker, turning a deep, warning red. Choose, brother, Sophia whispered, her voice dripping with a poisonous finality. The original sister who suffered for your sins, or the copy who represents a future you don't deserve. One lives, the others burn.